Welcome to Global VID, a podcast about original productions and international TV and film distribution. I'm your host, Eric Y. Lapointe, and we're about to learn how people in our industry are expanding their footprint and finding the right partners around the world. This show was created by Now Global and is also available as an audio format on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast application. And welcome everybody to today's episode of Global VID with Conrad Buck, the editor-in-chief of the weekly industry newsletter called The Bulletin. We can now officially announce that The Bulletin and Global VID will be collaborating together and we'll be doing a reoccurring episode every 3 months to bring us up to speed on new trends and industry moves. And we first did a Bulletin episode last year. We had a lot of fun doing it, so I'm really happy to have Conrad back with us today. Good morning, Conrad. How are you?
Very well. How are you, Eric?
I'm very good. I'm glad to have you back on this show and for us to start talking again about the most recent industry news. So let's start maybe with the first topic, which is how you personally feel 2021 has started off so far compared to last year. And I'd love to get your personal feedback on this.
It's funny because once you start talking about years and months, you kind of have to think, okay, what month are we in now? And that's the challenge of everybody working from home. The time is just kind of a bit merged and a bit strange. But I mean, definitely for me, it's still the big pay TV and the transition to streaming services. I mean, that is really happening everywhere. What was going to happen from a transition standpoint on pay TV over 5 years really has happened in the last year. And I was thinking about this morning because I saw some numbers about that the cord cutting is slowing down and the amount of people that are canceling pay TV is starting to level out. And I think from a cable perspective, 2019 was sort of the band-aid, which was streaming was already on, and it was going to be slowly pulled off over the next 5 years with little or no. I wouldn't have expected there to be such a huge rush for all of the studios and platforms to come out with their streaming services all in 12 months. And that's really what happened last year. And I think it might have been the best thing. Obviously, there was a huge drop in the amount of pay TV subs around the world, especially with lack of sports, which also on the same side, 50% of cable subscribers keep their cable subscription for sports. So looking back on it, I think that it could be a really good thing for the cable industry because they really are starting to know what they're left with rather than just seeing this slow decimation of their subscriber base over the next 5 years. They're really at a point now where they are getting an idea with how many they are left with customers, and they can probably focus on maybe getting some of those customers back. I think this year people are experimenting on the streaming services. People are at home, and I think they have more time to sort of tinker around and look at all of the range of services. I mean, there are over 300 streaming services. So I think 2021 is going to see some settling. There's definitely going to be more movement. A lot of it depends on sports. That is one of the big key things that are going to make people think about, are they going to continue paying the $150 a month for cable, or are they going to use that huge chunk of money to maybe have 7 or 8 different streaming services?
And you had mentioned in your bulletin in recent weeks that 55% of cable subscribers are subscribing because of sports. And then you also started talking about, that we might be getting into something new. So like we've heard coined before, streaming wars. You mentioned we might start to see a sports wars between the cable operators and the broadcasters, but also potentially the platforms that may want those rights moving forward.
Of course. I mean, there's the streaming ecosystem, but sports is almost a completely separate thing. It really is. I mean, you could just be a specialist just on sports rights for cable. It is like nothing else that is it's not like a studio franchise or a kids animation franchise. You know, sports is tied to so many different complex levels. You've got the in-person spectator, you've got the at-home spectator, you've got the contracts, which are tied to the broadcaster who owns the rights for each individual franchise, whether it be the NHL or NASCAR, whether it be NFL, or whether it be, you know, all the other myriad of things. And then you've got the advertising commitments that are around it. You've got all the merchandise that is all tied around it. It really is this kind of very tightly managed ecosystem that is just not set up right now to deal with a spread. You know, let's put this here, let's put that there. You know, Amazon takes these rights and this platform takes these rights. So it's really going to be interesting to see what happens. And there's just an enormous amount of money that is tied to sports. You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was like, well, are people going to keep paying $150 a month when they're not getting any sports? And I think they will. I think that sports is going to return. You know, you're either a sports fan or you're not. If you keep cable for sports, you're always going to keep cable for sports, unless there is a worthwhile alternative. The problem with streaming dipping their toes into the sports world is that you're suddenly going to have a very fragmented marketplace, which is what happened with Premier League soccer in the UK. So Sky had exclusive rights to Premier League soccer. And everybody was up in arms about the fact that if you wanted to watch Premier League soccer, you had to have Sky. They got into a situation where regulatory and monopoly, they broke it up. So Amazon ended up with some matches, now ended up with others, and then Sky kept the rest. So now as a Premier League sports fan, I had to subscribe to 3 services if I wanted to watch Premier League soccer. And then people are like, well, I wish it was just all on Sky. And it's like, well, that's what everybody was complaining about in the beginning.
And now they're paying more money.
And now they're paying more money.
So here's a wild card that could potentially accelerate this, just like we saw 2020 accelerate streaming. Last night, I was listening to Radio Canada, actual radio, and they said, 50% of the NHL teams right now are bleeding because normally 50% of the revenue would come from the box office, the actual ticket sales, not just television. So is that potentially the accelerator for all of this, for the new sports wars? Because could that create the situation where they're hungrier for money than ever before? And I'm talking about all leagues right now. And the platforms might be in the right place right now to start those negotiations in a difficult year that was for sports.
It's funny that you mentioned the NHL because those rights are up for renewal very, very soon. So it is going to be really interesting to see where it goes. I think ultimately, I would love to have one destination for all sports. I mean, I think if you're a sports fan, you tend to like more than one sport, but that's not really the way it's going to go. But I think there needs to be better access for sports across all services. I'm quite surprised about the ticket sales. I mean, that really highlights the vulnerability of the amount of revenue that comes from in person. And either that's the ticket prices are quite high anyway, and seasonal passes are really high. How do you translate a seasonal pass that costs, I don't know how much a season pass is, but if somebody was buying a subscription to a season pass at home, there would be a massive difference in revenue. So are they going to make that up by attracting new people to the sport? Or is it going to be the same group of people that would normally buy a season pass for in-person that are just going to buy the season pass for at home? And there's going to be hundreds and hundreds of dollars that are going to be missing. So how do you make that up? Do you go out and find a new sports fan? Or do you make that up on more advertising because people are watching it more at home? I don't know. It's a really tricky one when so much is taken up from in-person revenue, which at the moment, we don't know when that's coming back. I mean, it will come back, but it could be another 6 to 12 months.
So I think people are going to start to feel like this is a sports show soon. But I do have one more question. or one more topic that I want to talk about. And that is the Super Bowl weekend with the Weeknd from Toronto, who performed the halftime show. First of all, we saw a Super Bowl pull off a very successful hybrid format with 22,000 people in the audience. And I think, I don't know if this was a clever marketing ploy, but kudos to the NFL for ensuring that 1/3 of the audience, I believe, were frontline workers who had been vaccinated. So there was some safety already in the air with that first pandemic and hopefully last pandemic football game. But we also saw something really interesting, which also created a little bit of unnecessary controversy. And that was the performance of The Weeknd, who chose to spend $7 million of his own money. And by making that choice, because they are competing events to a certain extent, or at least competing broadcasters, is the Grammy Awards would not allow The Weeknd to perform at their event if he was performing at the Super Bowl. And I think his team made a calculation as to what would be the most lucrative. And not only that, they decided it was worthwhile to spend money to create this made for TV event, as opposed to just showing up on some weird square shaped stage in the middle of the field without, really interesting props. What did you make of the show, and what did you make of the people who are complaining that it wasn't Bruce Springsteen?
The Weeknd, it was purely a really smart business move on their side. It wasn't, it would be good for him to perform at the Super Bowl, and yes, it's going to cost $7 million. It was purely a really smart business move for them to have the Super Bowl audience. And I think they knew that because of the nature of the Super Bowl during the pandemic, it would probably attract a younger audience anyway, out of curiosity. Double the fact that it's The Weeknd, which would also attract fans of The Weeknd whose tour had been canceled after his last album release because of COVID. So there was a huge Weeknd fan base that haven't seen him perform. And yes, it did cost him $7 million, but you have to remember the Super Bowl fronts all of the production costs. So they basically pay the $10 to $15 million of the production and all of the staging and everything. He only had to pay the $7 million. So he got plenty of value out of it. And then there's statistics since that after every single artist that performs at the Super Bowl, there's something like a 500 increase in ticket interests for that artist. And The Weeknd alone on his Starboy tour made about $80 million. And in the last 4 years, he's made close to $300 million in touring. And he's now obviously put out dates for either later, I think it's this year or next year, for a tour. So the $7 million investment when he's getting the largest audience in North America, I think was a brilliant move.
Now, I'm just curious, was he forced to spend that $7 million, or was that a personal choice? My hunch was that he didn't have to spend that money. He could have just been on a regular stage, but he wanted to make a big deal out of it, obviously, because it would have looked a little weird to have like an empty field without all the people that they normally crowd around an artist. It would have looked really empty. Do you know if he was obliged to spend that money, or I know they're not paid to perform at the Super Bowl, but I can't imagine they would force them to pay for additional set design.
I imagine that there were some certain costs that every artist has to expense when they do a Super Bowl appearance. It could have been travel, it could have been his own quarantine, it could have been he has to pay for all of the performers that are on his team. I imagine every single time an artist performs at the Super Bowl, they had to pay something. I just think it was just a reality that they made that amount public, and people started to put two and two together that he's going to really make it back in either streaming or he's going to make it back in his future tour. I mean, no artist is getting that frontline promotion right now. Nobody. I mean, you think about it, he was probably the only artist in the last 12 months that has really got that amount of on-screen coverage. I mean, nobody else is touring or appearing anywhere.
So let's shift gears with our Q1 Bulletin review. So next up in terms of topics that obviously the big news is Netflix has announced that they are going to set up an office in Canada. We don't yet know where that might be, but do you have some early hunches, Conrad?
Netflix, it was interesting. The same week that they announced that they were setting up an office in Canada, they were announced they were setting up an office in Italy as well. And the two were quite different announcements. The Italian office was very much to focus on producing content for the Italian market, whereas the Canadian announcement was a little bit more light on the intention. You know, there was discussion about some of the great successes that they've had with some of the series, like Anne with an E was one.
Which was also done in part with our great CBC.
And surprisingly, even in other territories like the UK and Korea, it is not uncommon for Netflix to do a co-production with a local broadcaster. But for the Canada side, what I'm seeing is that Netflix is really looking at certain territories to put their foot down from a physical production standpoint. If you go to the UK, there has been somewhat of a real estate battle between Amazon, Netflix, and Apple to snap up the key recording and studio locations that are best suited in those countries. Netflix is over at Pinewood. Amazon have just put their foot down for some serious real estate. And poor Apple has ended up in somewhere 40 miles outside of London in a warehouse because they were kind of late to the game. So every streaming service is looking at their key markets and thinking, okay, we need to put our foot down to get those huge production facilities locked in, you know, whether it's going to be in Vancouver or in Toronto. And then the second thing is that, you know, we talked about there's three reasons why a company like Netflix would make such an announcement. Number one is there a government or not regulatory, but is there more of an obligation for them to set up a base within a country, especially when they're not necessarily at loggerheads with the local broadcasters, but you know, local broadcasters are feeling the Netflix bite at their ankles. So I think, you know, Netflix is showing that it wants to work locally with the talent. So there's that first thing. Is there a little bit of political pressure? Possibly. The second thing is, what is the demand for content to Canadians? So is it that Netflix is going to be producing content that they feel will be really popular with the Canadian marketplace? And then the third thing is that, is there more of a value for Canadian content outside of Canada? So, you know, what Canadian content could be exportable? I mean, if you look at Scandinavia, Denmark, Finland, and even France, a lot of the really successful series have been successful outside of those territories. So there's been more success on things like Border Town outside of Finland and in Finland. You know, is that going to happen in Canada? Or is there a huge demand for Canadian content within Canada itself? I mean, it really is going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Is there going to be Canada's Lupin? We don't know. It's going to be really interesting to see what Netflix in Canada produces.
The answer might be all of the above in terms of like, is it regulatory reasons? Probably. I mean, Netflix still doesn't pay taxes here in Canada. I don't know the full details, but certainly as consumers, we do not pay taxes on our memberships. But then at the same time, there has been a lot of successfully created content by Netflix that has been done here in Canada. I mean, their very first original was filmed in Ontario, if I'm not. Hemlock Grove was filmed in Ontario, right? So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what will happen from that.
Actually, that's an interesting point. Is it going to be Canadian content or is it going to be Canadian filmed content? So that could be another kind of twist to it.
They would be Canadian content because Netflix, like everybody else, would want to take advantage of the tax credit system. By the way, Netflix is actually considered, if you look at the CAVCO, CRTC, Canadian Heritage websites, Netflix Canada is officially considered a Canadian broadcaster for tax credit purposes. So they're already kind of swimming in that space. And the only other American platform that is on that list is Apple Plus and indirectly iTunes as well.
And the other thing, maybe they're looking south of the border. I mean, the US marketplace has been snapping up foreign programming more than ever. I mean, the foreign language series and films in the US are extremely popular, which is quite a new thing for the US consumer. So maybe there's like a middle ground where maybe there is, just because of the language and the geolocation, maybe a good slate of Canadian series could do relatively well in the US.
So let's follow this story closely. I'm glad that we're meeting every quarter now, so we can kind of see how this evolves. So best guess, where is the head office going to be, Conrad?
I think the head office is going to be in Vancouver.
Okay. That's funny because I'm going to say Toronto. Because all the other major broadcasters are already based in Toronto. I would love to see it in Vancouver. That would really help our local economy to grow, especially with more original content. And for sure, we have producers here that have the potential of doing that. I do think it's going to land in Toronto. And the other reason, and it made me think about that, is the fact that, Toronto is also a 6-hour drive away from Montreal. Because I would imagine Netflix will still want to kind of keep that close tie with French Canada as well.
Yeah, and it's one thing to do the production, but you have to hire all of the support system to go around it, from production to administration to strategy to programming. And Toronto has all of that. I mean, it's a very vibrant media community there. All the broadcasters are there. So maybe they'll have a head office in Toronto, and then they'll have these smaller satellite locations in Montreal and Vancouver that can sort of pull everything together.
Vancouver could be in the running for sure, especially due to our local tax credits. They may want to be able to tap into that. Maybe that's their main goal in that. Anyways, time will tell. Well, hopefully on the next episode, we'll be able to declare the city winner.
We should keep an eye on the job postings. That's usually where you get all the intel from,
That's true. That is correct. Yeah. Next topic, the home TV is back. And this, we're going to start to sound like morning radio show hosts, I think, because from my perspective, I know that we've seen some of the statistics. You pointed some of them out in your bulletin. One of them was the most popular television were 65-inch televisions last year. And overall, there was a 20% year-over-year growth from 2019 to 2020 in flat screens. So as family units, are we coming back together? So maybe we can talk about your own perspective as a parent of two lovely teenage kids. I don't know. I have never met them, but I imagine they're lovely.
No, that's true. I mean, so TV buying is always in cycles. So there's always it's a very cyclical thing that people keep, and then they tend to leave it to the last minute before they upgrade. I saw this year, especially with things like the Super Bowl and people at home, the TV became more of this center point within the house. People are working at the dining room table, kids are at the dining room table because they can't be trusted to do their homeschooling in their bedroom. So the kind of the family living room, or if a lot of people are in open plan, it really became that kind of center. The cost as well. I mean, this is really the first year that we have seen streaming OSs subsidizing the sale of television hardware. And by that, I mean Samsung TV is sold with the Samsung OS. You've got HCL partnering up with Roku, so it's now a Roku TV. And these are sold heavily discounted, because if you look at the lifetime of how long somebody will keep their TV for, it's probably like 5 to 10 years. So if you're only using the Roku platform, or you're only using Samsung or LG, and they've got all of their ad supported, you can sign up for different apps within it, they know that there's going to be continuing revenue coming in. Whereas, 3 years ago, LG, if they sold a TV, they would need to claw up as much of that money up front, because they would not see this recurring revenue coming from a TV buyer. It's just you buy the hardware, that's it. and then you would buy a streaming stick or you would buy an Apple TV device, and it would be those devices that would be receiving the recurring revenue from advertising. But now you've got Roku that are just launching TVs out at very, very low prices with everything built in. You don't need to spend the $30 on the Roku stick, and they have all of that data from what you're watching across all of the platforms. And I think that really has lowered the cost of TVs to the point where I bought a 40-inch TV, which for me is more than enough, and it cost me under $300. That would have been absolutely unheard of 2 years ago.
And do you feel the quality is just as good?
The quality is well, don't forget, so I was saying people only buy TVs like every probably 6 to 10 years. So for me, this was a huge upgrade from a 32-inch, what I think was a flat screen, but it was still that wide.
Right.
And the other thing now is that you can buy them, and you can buy an 80-inch television and get it delivered. You don't need to rent a U-Haul truck and go to Best Buy and pick it up yourself. You can just get it delivered and somebody will bring it to your door and it's all ready to go. So I just think that it was a kind of a perfect storm. There was so many promotions around the Super Bowl for the big screen TV. I really think the big screen TV is back. I think the family viewing is back. Yes, my kids still go off and do, they're on their phones, but they're mostly on social networks. So they're not really watching things on their phones. It's TikTok or it's Instagram or it's messaging, but they really appreciate the big screen.
But the family has come back together more during this pandemic, during this time where normally we'd maybe be going to the cinemas. Then we're like making popcorn nights and whatnot. And it's great to hear that your family, even with teenage kids who are independent, are still getting together. And so hopefully this will be a trend that we'll see continue, just in the sense that, not every week, but on a monthly basis. It's maybe a great way for families to get together without having to spend so much money in the cinemas as well. And I think for us, it certainly, we've gotten way more like where we would kind of just allow them to watch their couple cartoons that they were allowed per day. We've also switched our family into watching more co-viewing together, and that includes documentaries recently that we started watching, and pushing the kids a little bit to, they don't necessarily want to watch that kind of content at the end of the day, but once they're pushed to discover something new, they're ultimately having a lot of fun and following along with the stories. So
yeah, and it's also down to the age group as well. I mean, mine are teenagers, and as soon as we got Disney Plus, we went back and we watched all the films that we used to watch when they were young, because you could only rent them on iTunes or you could only buy them on Blu-ray, and now everything was there. And then as a parent, you sort of want to watch films that you enjoyed, but you have to wait until they're a certain age group, depending on what the film is. And it's great because Disney just launched Star, and I went to Star this week because it launched in Canada, and there are just so many movies on there that are familiar, and there are things that I haven't seen in years that are not available on Amazon Prime, not available on Netflix, but they're immediately recognizable, and I must have already added about 30 movies to my watch list. And that's another interesting thing, and it kind of goes back to it always takes me 25 minutes to find something to watch. But when you've got everything is original or unknown, having suddenly this familiar streaming option where you've got titles that you haven't seen in years, but you would love to watch it again, I think it's a great offering.
This is a great segue to maybe start talking about what's new with all the different platforms, obviously with Disney Plus.
So if you have Disney Plus, you can just now go and it just is like Marvel, National Geographic, Pixar, and then it's got Star. And then you have to authenticate because it's, mature content. They want to make sure that kids that have access to Disney Plus can't have access to Star. But then when I opened up Star, you've got the Aliens trilogy. There's just so many movies on there that I haven't seen anywhere that I think, I'd love to watch that on my new TV, And I really think the nostalgia area is really important. It takes a lot of effort to find something to watch in originals and then commit to trying it out if you don't really know anything about it. And I think we're still at that point where people just want to come home and just veg out, or they just want something familiar, a bit like music, kind of that nostalgia. And I think until we're really out of this current situation, the whole nostalgia thing will be a key part for programming. And I think Star will really take off on that. For me, whether I'll actually get around to watching them, and we always joke about that. When you work in the industry, you never have time for Netflix because you're always spending time catching up on what's going on in the industry. But I would much prefer to go back and watch something that I know the storyline and it's familiar than to maybe try something completely new, especially when everybody's so busy.
Okay, so let's talk about the other platforms just to kind of get ourselves up to speed with what's happening in the world of Tubi, Pluto. Tubi, obviously, we know, and as we mentioned last year, that they were purchased by Fox Corp for a whole lot of money. Pluto TV is currently expanding under its Viacom CBS ownership, and I know they have plans to grow into Spain very soon, but I've also heard many other rumors about what's likely going to happen in other continents around the world. Do you want to give any quick update on any one of these platforms of your choice?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give a quick update on all of them, actually. I mean, Tubi. So Tubi is an ad-supported on-demand service. Just sign up, doesn't cost you anything. They have an enormous library, many familiar titles, many unfamiliar titles. They really are going for volume. They have about 20 million subscribers right now. And the interesting news that came out last week is that they're going to start to integrate local live news channels into Tubi. So they really want Tubi to be your sort of center point to go to for all of your content needs. And the other thing related to live news is that was one of the local news, is that was one of the reasons people were keeping their cable subscriptions. It wasn't just sports, it was local news channels. And that was very important. Local news was very important last year, not only for getting up-to-date information on COVID, what's happening in your town or your state or your county, and also for the election as well. I mean, obviously there was Fox and there was CNN, but people really wanted to tune into their local news. So adding local news feeds to Tubi is a really interesting move, and that will be interesting to see how that expands. On the Pluto side, they are expanding out internationally. Like a lot of the other ad-supported platforms, I think that they will tread carefully on where they expand to. There are some countries that are more than happy to watch content with advertising. There are some set territories where they're extremely averse to advertising and they would rather pay a subscription. So I think a lot of these platforms are really looking at which markets are still very popular on the linear side. France is one of the reasons that Netflix rolled out their linear offering first in France, because linear viewing is still extremely popular in France. And it was a really good sort of local market choice for them to try it in a market where linear viewing is still very popular. Netflix is obviously expanding, same for Disney Plus, but both services in territories are reaching sort of saturation points. So they're looking at overseas markets. India is going to be one of the next big battlegrounds for Disney and Netflix. The biggest challenge is that once you start expanding your service outside of high-priced markets like Europe, UK, and US and Canada, you have to lower your price in order to meet local competition. So Netflix is not going to be rolling out at $10 a month in India. It's going to be, a couple of dollars a month. And that's really going to affect their average revenue per user, which is going to be quite diluted over the next 12 months. So it's really going to be interesting to see how the market responds to this year when they see the average revenue per user across the board going down as these paid streaming services launch into lower price markets. And I don't think it's a bad thing. I just think it's something that the market and analysts need to understand, that a drop in average revenue per user across the board isn't a bad thing. It's just a matter of fact when you've got near saturation point in, say, the US, and you still need to grow. And then you set your sights on markets like India, where the price point is going to be a lot lower. But that's not to say that there's still not reasons to grow in the US. I mean, 30 million Americans still don't have broadband. And there's going to be an enormous national push to get broadband out to these 30 million Americans that don't have it. And that's almost the population of Canada. So there's still room to grow. It's just that there's not an infinite number of subscribers. So at what point do you get when you can't raise the price anymore? I mean, that's really going to be interesting over the next couple of years.
Well, we certainly we are maybe reaching a state of maturity at some point soon. And combine that with the pandemic, one of the things you said is, going from streaming wars to soon streaming recuperation. I love that term. Where did you get that from, or did you read that somewhere?
Everything was about the streaming wars, and it was, this started off at the end of 2019. The media picked up the streaming wars line, and it sort of, we spoke about this. It was almost as if there were two sides that were already established, and they kind of lived quite happily side by side together, cable and the streaming industry. And then suddenly they all went to battle. And it wasn't really like that. It was just, everything was just straight out of the gate, two different sectors battling with each other. And then it became the revolution, which was really last year, the streaming revolution. It was just, everything was about streaming. Everybody was desperate to launch their service as quickly as possible to get all of these people that were stuck at home, that were maybe thinking of cutting the cord because there was no sports, and people had extra money to spend. But now we're in the point where I sort of said it, I thought about it last week. I thought, well, how are we going to pay for all this? All of the content that's been pumped out, all of the marketing, all of the projections and predictions, how is it going to be recouped? And then that's when I said, well, now we're in the stage of the streaming recuperation. Disney Plus said that they're not going to turn a profit for another 5 years. So, there's a long road ahead. And how is all of this content going to be paid for in the long run? It's going to be really interesting to see how all of this investment is recouped.
So just recently, I attended Kidscreen. And, last year I was quite interested in the whole notion of virtual markets. How would it work? What would these conference companies be able to pull off? And if I were to give the 2020 award for virtual markets, I would give it to the company Brunico, based out of Toronto, because they really figured out very early on too, like they experimented with Banff World Media Festival last year as to how they can make this event exist. And they chose back then to make Banff last over a 2-month period. And the reason for that is they didn't want you to be like locked onto your computer screen for 8 hours a day, watching panels or having meetings. And so they kind of started figuring out the recipe quite well. And they are probably the model for any major conference company to copy. But so specifically for Kidscreen, I felt like everything they had already kind of learned last year was new and improved. And they created all these environments for people to organically network together and to meet serendipitously in the same way that we have always experienced at these physical markets. Yeah. So anyways, I just wanted to give a shout out to Kidscreen and the folks at Brunico in Toronto for pulling something off very successfully. Yeah, I had a lot of fun testing that out, and I think it's probably worthwhile for people to strongly consider the Banff market, if that's any indication as to what they're currently working on.
I normally attend NAPTI, MIPTV, South by Southwest, MEDEM, and MIPCOM. And I haven't attended any of them because they've been the exact timeline that you would have an in-person event, but online. For me, it's been impossible to do. I mean, when you travel, you block your calendar, your colleagues, your partners, the whole industry is at the same event. So and you're all on the same time zone, which makes things a lot easier. So turning a 4-day physical event into a 4-day online event, I just don't think is the way to go. And you and I had that sort of conversation where the whole idea of having these very quick intros, kind of like a speed dating thing to start off with, I think is great. It's like when you go and pick up your conference badge on the Sunday, you know, before you start, or you bump into somebody and you're just kind of, oh, I'm here. And I think that's a really nice way to start an event. But what I think they should do is that, so in January, it's CES, but your entire January is taken up with CES because you've got the planning, you've got the event, and then you've got the follow-ups. And then you've also got NAPTI, which is in January as well. And then my April is all about MIPTV. Even though it's a 4-day event, the whole month of April is about planning and organizing. And the same for October with MIPCOM. It's only a 4-day event, but the entire month is taken up planning. They should have everything spread out. So the whole month of October should be MIPCOM. And they should spread out the sessions so that it's a lot easier for people to juggle the real work that they're still doing with being able to dip in and out of MIPCOM. You know, maybe a month is too long, but to cram a physical event is just too much.
It's not too long, and that's exactly what Kidscreen did. Now, they didn't recopy the 2-month plan, which they tested last year, and probably for good reason. But what you found was in the first week, there were no panels. It was technically, they were considering it the market week. And that week they set up speed meetings with some of the key decision makers. And those were 8-minute long meetings. And most of the time, if you hit it off, because you're in this environment online, you can quickly exchange emails and then plan another meeting later on. If of course you see some kind of match. The other thing they did across the board every single day at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time is have kind of like a coffee meetup situation, or musical chairs, I believe is what they call it. And every 3 minutes, you would be meeting somebody new based on the kind of interest you had outlined or chosen when you signed up for Kidscreen in the first place. And so exactly like what you said, not only did I meet new people that I had never met before, but also, funny enough, I had bumped into people that I knew. One composer out of Los Angeles and another who's a partner in Northern Ireland as well. And I remember him joking like, oh, I thought you were going to hang up on me because we already know each other. Like, no, this is like the equivalent of running into each other in the hallway and being able to say hello for a very brief 3-minute period. And then the other thing that they really quickly did too is like they created this environment where you could actually not physically, but that you could sit down at a table in order to talk with other people. Well, of course, there were a few bugs in the start of the week. And I think people were dropping in on tables where they were not necessarily welcome. But again, all in the spirit of quick digital changes. In that same week, they labeled some of the tables party table, so that people had this idea of like, oh yeah, there's 6 people here already, but I can still drop in without worrying that I'm going to be rejected and outcasted.
I love the fact that they recreated the awkward moments that we all experience at the conferences where you're in the middle of a meeting and somebody interjects with a business card and you're like, excuse me, I'm in the middle of a meeting here, you know?
Yeah, that did happen. And I was a little bit more careful after. All right, Conrad, thanks so much for joining me again. I look forward to continuing this series together and bringing our friends up to speed with what's going on in the industry. You certainly helped a lot because, as I said, I was quite busy starting this year. Didn't always read up on the latest news. So thank you so much for coming in and sharing.
Very welcome.
With us.
Great to talk to you, Eric.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Okay.
And thanks for listening to today's episode of Global VID. That was my guest, Conrad Buck of the Bulletin. So thanks to the Bulletin, and also thanks to Nightwood for the music. See you guys next time.